Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Minnesota. This past 10 days or so has shown the world the worst and some of the best that Minnesota has to offer. While the Floyd family, their personal grief of watching a memorial service yesterday, and they also had to do it in the context that the world was watching. And the opportunity to talk about what's next, what's the road forward, what does this mean was very clear. This morning I had the opportunity to go out with community leaders. Some of that means elected officials, some of it means community leaders who are organically risen to that, and then business owners. Up in North Minneapolis, Broadway, down on Lake Street. I want to pay a specific thank you to some folks. You don't always see these sometimes in the legislature, but I can tell you they have risen to the occasion this last week. Senators Champion and Hayden, Senators Torres Ray, they were my hosts this morning. They were joined by Senator Disick. Also hosting was Representative Gomez, Hassan, Dean, and Dabney, and someone I've really appreciate, and I think certainly Hennepin County, but I would argue Minnesota is well served by County Commissioner Angela Connolly, who's been relentlessly trying to rebuild her community, and City Councilman member Jeremiah Ellison. They took me down there and we had informal talks, and it was for Minnesotans not in the area or have just seen the pictures on TV. It's one thing to see them, it's another to walk with a business owner who family has been there over 100 years and their business is no longer there. Or an immigrant business owner who started it with their savings 25 years ago to start a furniture store and to stand in what is a burned out building in a hole in the ground. And what that means, and it gets far more than just the property, because as we said, we are very lucky and we're very blessed that after George Floyd's murder, we didn't lose anybody else in this. But the destruction in the families is one thing. But this morning, and there was a lot of folks down there and numerous stories, the sense of hopefulness in a time that you may not believe that was there was overwhelming. Had a distillery owner tell me, Chris was saying, he was excited when he first did this. He's a pretty young guy. He said, I was excited when I started my first business, and anybody who's done it, it's the thrill of doing that and building something and getting it going. And that's gone now. But he said the thought of rebuilding in a new environment with the changes that are coming is even more exciting about what it can mean. That's pretty impressive. And then they talked about the reality of this. He said, yeah, I was severely undercapitalized. Most black-owned businesses are deeply undercapitalized, which meant they had not enough insurance. He also made some notes that I think, once again, the issues that Minnesotans are grappling with. Statistically, he said, if you go out there and ask for venture capital for a business like this, the average is about $1 million you'll get. Unless you're a woman of color, you get $47,000. Based on nothing else, nothing in the back. So he talked about, if we're talking about rebuilding, this is going to be a key piece of it. The fear that was echoed is that these businesses will leave and take the culture with them. That these businesses won't be able to rebuild, not just from an economic standpoint, but from a cultural standpoint. And the fear was echoed in the belief that if we don't do this right, and people end up selling these properties out, that the gentrification will destroy what was the unique culture of this area. And so there's a thoughtfulness on the ground, on the areas that extend, of course, on accountability on policing and criminal justice reform, but all of those issues. But then coming back to the businesses, how do you build into the community? So I have to tell you, it was gratifying, it was helpful, it was a challenge to all of us of what we're going to do. But the spirit of community there is strong. And I hope those are the stories that now get to told more and more often. I'd also like to say how grateful I am to the Minneapolis City Council for acting in an unprecedented manner on the commissioner's charge. Commissioner Lucero is here to talk to us a little bit about economics and equity in economics, but he'll certainly be able to answer some questions on the commissioner's charge. Things that have happened, and this morning, the first one I saw as I'm getting briefed as I'm doing thing, that the city of Minneapolis has banned chokeholds from the police department. When I hear that, the first thing I just have to be honest is that's a pretty damn low bar just to start with in terms of that we hadn't had that. But to think about this, that's in many communities. And it took this to get it done. And community activists, and I want to call this out, community activists who've been asking for these changes that can be made in the short term and then the systemic changes, this is how fast it can happen if you do it right. And I want to just be very clear to make sure that people know that the work that Commissioner Lucero and the Minnesota Department of Human Rights did was based on the legwork and the blood, sweat, and tears of activists over decades to try and formulate what works and what can change how we look at our communities. That's a really important part of this, that the Minnesota Department of Human Rights and the announcement we made last week was a catalyst to put in place what already happened in the Minneapolis City Council, which will then trickle down and need to be enforced into the culture of how we do policing. That's a pretty big change if you think about it. It was not forbidden to do a chokehold yesterday. Now today they put it in, and it is. So those who think that now is not the right time, and those who think that we need to think about this a little longer, have certainly not been paying attention. And if you needed the wake-up call, it happened last Monday and continues to right now. And then I'd like to talk about where we're at as a state, thinking about all of the things that can move together. We're going to have an announcement today in the midst of COVID-19, and many of you in the media and others have been still tracking this. We're still making sure that, again, as we started, we knew that when COVID-19 came here and when the pandemic started to spread by mid-February to early March, that the United States was not prepared, state of Minnesota wasn't prepared, that the transmissibility of this and the danger it posed to certain populations had the potential to overwhelm hospitals, as it had in Italy, as it had in Spain, as it had in New York City, and that we needed to create the space to be able to build up hospital capacity, to build up PPE, and then probably most importantly, learn how we live with it for the long haul until we get immunity or we get the vaccine. And that's just what Minnesota has been doing. And today we're prepared to take another step of turning that dial. And I'm going to have Commissioner Grove, Commissioner Malcolm explain in greater detail. But starting next Wednesday, June 10th, we will be turning that dial. We'll head back into our restaurants with some capacity restrictions that will be in place, gyms, fitness studios, other operations. We believe we should be able to handle this. We're looking at it. I'm not going to say, and I think Commissioner Malcolm will be the first one to say it, we can't get complacent and we can't get lazy around what will happen here. We're going to really need to once again ask people to help make this work. This is the personal responsibility piece. If we all pack back in and we get next together, and we know that these last 10 days have been difficult with that, we're going to hear Commissioner Lucero talk about how we will do that. We're going to make sure that we're not asking workers to go back into unsafe conditions without providing them the testing and the tracing and the isolation, and to make sure the hospital capacity is there for when they need it. These steps will be critically important. Commissioner Malcolm will be announcing. We passed 11,000 tests yesterday, even in the midst of what's happening in the confusions. We have the capacity now to reach those numbers we talked about. The idea just a month ago that we could test over 10,000 people on a daily basis was that moonshot we were looking for. Now we're ramping closer to, at the height of this, we'd like to get up to over 20,000 if that's what we need. And I think what Minnesotans need to remember is we may need to do this till next February or March or whenever that time comes. But that doesn't mean we can't be smart about how we roll back into businesses. We'll talk about swimming pools being able to open. We'll talk about what youth sports look like. We'll talk about indoor activities like theaters and those types of things that we can do, and look where our movement is and what it means if we get the spike, what it means if we see down the road here 10 days or so from what's happened this week, if we're going to see that. But I'd like to say one of the things, and this is gratifying to me, I talked earlier about those representatives that sometimes you don't hear that much about, but the way the system works is these are people that are on the ground. I was getting texts at 2:30 a.m. for people standing next to burning gas stations. I got text and calls, and I talked to Jeremiah Ellison, who put Trey on the phone, who owned a barber shop, and he's on the phone this morning telling us about what happened. He and his council member were out there throwing buckets of water on a fire in his shop when this is happening. That's neighbor to neighbor. This is what it was about, and then telling us what they need to do to rebuild. And then I have to tell you, out in greater Minnesota, about this idea, how do we reopen again? How do we get there? Dave Lisselgard's a member of Minnesota House from up north. He was the mayor of Aurora. He's a union guy. Just one of these members of the House that you don't hear about in the paper a lot because they're just a grind it out, do the work type of person. He has been funneling things from business owners who are saying this, who want to reopen safely. They're concerned about, are they going to be viable afterwards? They don't have a lot of cases up and around their Hibbing area or wherever they're talking about. He's conveying back through his leadership and directly to me what needed to be done and telling us this is what needs to happen. So I want to thank, there's lots of them, but if the example today of what it looked like Dave Lisselgard making that case and trying to get this right. And so we're excited about this. You're going to hear them talk about, Commissioner Harrington will talk about it, and he will say, and I'll talk more about this, about removing the curfews because Minnesotans and here in Minneapolis and St. Paul and the surrounding areas have shown that they've risen to the occasion. This is their city. It will be done the way they want to see things done in terms of respectful protest being at the heart of the change that needs to come. So I think with that being said, that worst part we saw earlier in the week and the best that Minnesota has to offer, we have that chance now.